Fancy Princess 92. My name's Ashley, and in today's video I wanted to do a DIY moss pole. So I will just brief you on a few different methods I've tried to make this moss pole. I've watched a bunch of different videos and I took little pieces of each video that I watched and I tried a few different ways to make this. So I've tried the moss pole where they took moss and just wrapped fishing line around the moss. And I've also tried the plastic mesh method of the moss pole. And then what I have here today is my favorite out of the three, which is chicken wire. This method I like the best because for me and my plants, it held up the best. It was the sturdiest and it just was the most aesthetically pleasing. If you can see in the background here, I made a mini version of this moss pole a few weeks ago because I wanted to test it out, see how it went, and see how stable and how well it would hold up for my plants. And it looks really nice, and it held up really nicely. None of the moss fell out, and it was really sturdy. So I'm going to just go through this process with you, show you what I use and how I make this moss pole here today. So I'm going to use the chicken wire, as I mentioned. This comes in, it's 24 inches in length this way. Of course, if you need a bigger moss pole though, you can always roll it out the long way and then cut it this way. Now I just cut it for the 24-inch length because I'm going to make a 2-foot moss pole. Then we need PVC piping. What I like also, and I've seen a lot of people when they make these moss poles, they use a wood stake or a bamboo stake, and over time that stuff tends to rot away. Once your plants have taken to that moss pole and it rots, it's really hard to then pick the aerial roots from out of the sphagnum when they kind of get engaged in there. So that tends to really be very much of a hassle. So I chose to use PVC piping. It is a 1/2 inch in diameter. So it is the smallest size in diameter that at least my hardware store carried. This comes in a 10 feet long of length. And I cut mine to about a little bit, no, it's probably a little bit over 24 inches because the chicken wire I'm using is 24 inches and you need to have a little bit below enough that it will have the stability into the pot you're putting it into. Again, you can cut these to any size you want. It's how big of a moss pole you need to hold this together. I have zip ties here that I will then enclose this with and kind of just zip it together through the wire, through the fencing. So I already have a piece pre-cut. When you are cutting and working with this wire, it is very sharp because you're cutting the edges. So I would advise wear some kind of glove that gives you a little bit of support for your hands. That way your skin doesn't get scratched or cut. To cut the wire, you want to use something a little sharp. Scissors wouldn't cut through this wire, so you need more of a wire cutter to get through this. And also, when you're cutting through the fencing, you want to make sure you cut directly in the middle of one of the little octagons or whatever they're called, because if you cut too much towards one end, the end will twist open and then you'll have an open end. Not only will that be sharp, but it will make it so when you go ahead to close this together, you have less space to zip tie and you'll have to go in more, which will kind of throw off the balance of your moss pole. So we want to start by taking a layer. You have to wet your sphagnum moss. I've let this soak for maybe about a 1/2 hour. And it's all ready to go. It's all wet. You do want to wring this out before you put it in. You don't want to put it in soaking wet because I've also found when I put it in soaking wet, then it dries out and it gets a little more flaky and just doesn't go well. So I'm gonna wring out what I use first. Another safety tip, actually, you probably want to wear a pair of goggles when you're cutting the chicken wire, because when you're cutting small pieces, that cut tends to make them fling, and you don't want it to fling into your eye. So after we get our first layer down there, I am going to go ahead and put the PVC piping in place. Now, I do want this to go maybe about 5 inches below where the chicken wire ends, because I want to make sure it has enough pull to establish itself and, you know, grab onto that soil so it won't kind of fall over. Then I'll go ahead and put the top layer on, and you really do want to kind of jam pack these full. You want to fill them so they're really nice and tight. I think that really is the trick here to keeping them well put together. You can always take out, you know, if you have too much, so more is always better. And you don't want to fill all the way to the tippy top, because I am going to fold the top over a little bit, and that will create that top part of this MossPole. So if it's filled all the way to the top, that leaves me no room to kind of enclose the top of the MossPole. So I'm leaving the PVC piping about 2 inches from the top of the chicken wire, and then I'm going to put maybe about 1/2 inch of moss on top of it. So that will leave 1.5 inches of just plain chicken wire that I will fold over and enclose. All right, so now width-wise for my chicken wire, I cut it, you can measure or you can eyeball. I eyeballed it out, but I would say I have probably about 8 inches in width of my chicken wire. So this is going to be a thicker MossPole. You can make them any width you want. Obviously for smaller plants, you can have a smaller width, but if you are making a MossPole for a larger plant or more, even like a larger leaf plant, a larger stem plant, such as like a monstera, yeah, like a monstera would be a good example. You would want a thicker, more sturdy MossPole. Versus having a MossPole for like a pothos or a syndapsis. You would be able to make a skinnier one, and it would hold up just fine because there's not much weight to it, and the leaves don't get that large. But for the size of the leaves and for the size of the stem, it has a lot of weight to it. It will need more of a thick, and even the aerial roots themselves are pretty large. So I'm gonna go ahead and start at the bottom. And I'm going to add a little bit more in here. It's not as tight as I'd like it to be. And then at the bottom too, as you go, you'll see it just kind of comes together. Just as we're going to pinch the top closed and fold it over, you'll kind of just pinch the bottom closed as well. Now for this part, I am going to take my gloves off just because it'll be easier for me to work the zip ties. But if you do take your gloves off, like I said, you just want to be very careful because you are going to be working with the ends that were cut, so they are going to be sharp. So before I tie in the bottom, I'm going to go ahead and zip tie all the way up. Now my hands are wet, so it is a little slippery, so I'm just using needle nose pliers to grab onto the zip tie and just pull it as tight as possible. It makes it so that it has a little more grip so you can get a little bit tighter. You don't need to put this on every little octagon you have. I'm probably going 2 or 3 apart, and that will be plenty to hold it together. So now here what I'm doing is, if you remember in the beginning of this video, I advised you to cut in the middle of the octagon so that way they didn't come apart. I have 2 here that twisted apart. Now they won't make a big difference, but I am just taking the needle nose pliers and trying to twist them back together. You don't have to do that. There's plenty to hold it, so it's not going to make a big difference. I just prefer it. Also, once I go ahead and finish each one of these, I will be taking the pointy tips and bending them inwards. That way they're not on the edge. I obviously won't be touching this or running my hands against it, but if ever I go to repot this plant that I'm going to be putting it in and I need to work with it, I won't have those sharp edges, so I won't have to worry about cutting my hands. So far, this is turning out really well. It's coming together really nicely. When I'm done, if you can see from there, I have a couple pieces that are just kind of hanging out. I just kind of go through and pull those off, but without pulling any of the sphagnum that's inside out. I just like it better, a little more cleaner. So I like that. I like to kind of pull those out or kind of tuck them in a little bit, just to keep it a little cleaner. Alright, so this is the last one. We're at the top here. And now I will go ahead and come a little closer and kind of show you what I'm going to do next. So as you see here, the moss pole looks really nice. It's really sturdy. It's not going nowhere. It's going to hold up the plant very nicely. If you notice here, you can see the pointy edges. One here, you got them coming in right here. I'm going to take all of those and bend them inwards. That way they're into the sphagnum and not going to poke me next time I go to touch this thing. Okay, so I have them all bent inwards, and now what I'm left with here is to enclose the top and enclose the bottom of my moss pole. So this is what I'm gonna do. With the bottom here, I just kind of stuff it in a little bit. And I'm gonna go ahead and just put a moss pole, put a zip tie from this wire to this wire, and that will kind of enclose it into the bottom. So that did that, tidied that up really nice. And then I kind of just squeeze it to kind of give it a little shape at the bottom. And that way the wire kind of gets tight the whole way around the rest of the pole. I just squeeze it in. There you have it. I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing at the top. I'm kind of just going to pinch this in like that and sort of just fold it over. And again, when you do that, you want to make sure you bend in the sharp tips. These were big enough that I could do them with my fingers. Oh, just a couple here that are kind of really sharp. So let me just bend those inwards. And I'm gonna kind of do the same thing. I'm just gonna kind of push it together, but being very careful that I don't get my fingers on any of those sharp edges. And the top is done. You can see I have a little bit of the moss pole showing there, but that's easily fixed. I just maneuver some of the moss around to this side, and there you go. It's all covered up. So that's pretty much it. I'm gonna now go ahead and cut off all of the long pieces of the zip ties. And I'm just gonna do with scissors. And I'm gonna cut all the way down to the base. And there we have it. Then, like I said before, I just go around and tuck the little pieces that are sticking out kind of in there really nice, because I like it a little more of a clean look. Some of them I pull out if they're hanging off a little too much. And then as this dries, it gets a little more firmer, but you really want to make sure you jam pack it so that way it's not too loose and it's not coming out of here. This is going to hold up really nicely. The plants are going to love grabbing onto this. I have my Syndapsis in a pot with one of these moss poles, and it already is starting to have its aerial roots form and kind of grab onto the moss pole, and that's only after a few weeks. So plants really do appreciate having that little bit of support. And you know, when you make it yourself, you know what it's made with, you know the quality of your sphagnum. So if that's something that matters to you, this is definitely a big plus of making your own moss pole. It is also a lot cheaper, not that moss poles are that expensive, but they can get expensive if you have to buy a lot of them, if you have to constantly replace them because your plants are outgrowing them. This is a nice solution. You can always make them a little bit bigger than you need them. That way your plant will grow into them. As we know, plants are forever growing, so they definitely will grow into them. I am going to just grab the Syndapsis behind me that has the same moss pole in it, just a mini version, just to show you what a plant looks like with the moss pole attached. So here is the mini one I made, and it looks really cute with the Syndapsis kind of growing on it. And if you can see here, this is already attached to the moss pole. Now I do not get my moss poles wet, and the aerial roots do just fine sticking onto it. So It's really not necessary to spray these down, to water them. I'm sure them being wet would probably speed up the process, but I have not had any issues with any of my plants without wetting the moss poles. Thank you guys again for joining me in another video. I hope you really enjoyed seeing how I made today's moss pole. I hope I gave you a lot of great tips, and I hope you'll enjoy trying one of these out for yourself. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you're interested in the content I provide. And as always, every plant's a princess. Bye.